I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Hey, peace, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like Live. Again, I'm Jared Ball, your host. Happy to be here. As usual, please go to imixwhatilike.org at some point and make sure you're subscribed there so you don't miss all of the work that I and my colleagues are doing, which is ever expanding and changing. And is across multimedia. So the best way to not miss any of it beyond these live streams is to be signed up there. And of course, we do want you to like, share, and subscribe here. Become a member, click the join button and consider that. Very shortly, I'm going to be happily announcing a new venture and project that you can be supportive of. News media collaboration and new venture, of course, always remaining focused on the same politics, same approach, more of the same, and also focused on political imprisonment. And of course, as we'll be talking about here in just a few minutes, Dr. King, happy birthday to him once again. And as others have pointed out for a long time, not only was he at one point a political prisoner, but had he not been assassinated, he more than likely would have ended up as one subsequent to that. So please do invite folks to come join us, or at least share this later. I think if for nothing else, what we're about to do this morning is going to be a good way to start a commemoration of the actual birthday today of Dr. King. And then also, of course, throughout the weekend, is a lot will be done into the holiday in a variety of ways, and in many ways moving in an opposing political trajectory or pole towards opposing political pole from where we're going to be talking about today, what at least the historical record seems pretty clear was the more real Dr. King, but it's certainly my biased approach. So, take it for what you will. And similarly, not as someone who claims, I certainly don't claim to be an expert on Dr. King. I just have done some research in terms of the way media have dealt with him. I have read, of course, some of his work and put it into a certain context. And we'll talk about that. So please do get into the comments and chats, like, share, subscribe, and all that kind of good stuff as well. Once again. And then, of course, please do come back at 10 o'clock where, my original crew will be gathered to do the Hubert Henry Harrison 2020 Hate Awards, which is a comedic and satirical look at all that prevents liberation and revolution, and something that we think is desperately needed after this last year. We want to revive our old radio tradition of doing these awards, and I think this would be officially the 8th. We're calling it the 8th annual. So anyway, okay, so what I'm going to do is do this presentation. It's a presentation I put together many years ago, actually, and I've sort of expanded it here or there a little bit, but I figured it would be a good way to bring to this platform. It would be good to bring it to this platform, and again to start off this day and this weekend of commemoration of Dr. King. Again, most of which that does not deal with what I'm going to suggest should be dealt with. So, all right. So I'll do this, and then I'm going to show this and talk a little bit about it. We'll come back. I'll see if there are any comments or questions, and we'll go from there. So, all right. Let me pull this up here. And what this is essentially is a presentation that a sort of a summary of a presentation that I've been doing for a number of years on the way Dr. King was dealt with in the press as more of a sign of the way he would ultimately be dealt with physically, and then has been dealt with posthumously in image and branding, or that is rebranding. Anyway, so what I've done here is just I know that what I'm going to describe here in the context of the Washington Post has been done in a variety and across multimedia, but I think it's a good summary of how mainstream and commercial press have dealt with him, and in like a lot of commercial media and punditry as well. So as I talk about here, I'm not sure what this is doing here. Let me get rid of that. That's not necessary. Oh no, I'm sorry. I think this is the date where this picture took place, where the one time these two met, and I can be checked on that. But the purpose of the image here in terms of this presentation is that, and I'm sorry, this isn't showing up as, so when I play this, I don't think it's playing. So I'm not able to actually have everything show up as it should. Oh, well, all right, that's fine. I didn't realize that. That's it's a small thing. So mess it up a little bit stylistically, aesthetically, but that's not a big deal. Anyway, so but the purpose of this image in terms of the context of this presentation is to show that while often Dr. King and Malcolm X are meant to be seen as polar opposites or juxtaposed against one another, certainly in popular imagination, it wasn't only that the two were eventually planning to come together and working together. They had, through intermediaries and discussion, joining forces, etc. But it wasn't so much that Malcolm was, quote unquote, softening to the politics of Dr. King. It was more that Dr. King was radicalizing to the politics of a Malcolm X. And so it is, on the one hand, natural and logical that they would have been coming together, and then, of course, natural and logical that they would have been dealt with in much similar fashion by the state. And, by the way, posthumously in images, both have been wildly rebranded in almost in ways that are meant to not reflect who they were in real life, or more importantly, I think, the politics that they were working with. So again, just in terms of context, we start here with the FBI's counterintelligence program, which of course was targeting all forms of so-called radicalism and leftist activity. And as it directed itself towards the Black liberation struggle, it said here, quote, that its goal was to prevent the rise of a Black Messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Malcolm X might have been such a messiah. This was written in 1966, so he was already assassinated. He is the martyr of the movement today. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. King could be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrine, nonviolence, and embrace Black nationalism, end quote. So on the one hand, it's important to note the names here. We'll come back to that. Malcolm X, of course, Dr. King, the central figure for this presentation, Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture. By the way, in amazingly some of the more popular and well-funded and positioned and promoted scholarship on Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, the counterintelligence program is not even mentioned, nor is his own autobiography mentioned in what is supposed to be or purports to be a biography of the man. So we can maybe talk about that another time. And Elijah Muhammad or the Nation of Islam are all mentioned here. And then, of course, a very direct and explicit statement that King would be considered, quote unquote, a very real contender for the threatening position of a Black Messiah should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrine. So the FBI is at least explicit here in saying what is and is not acceptable as Black leadership, and what is or is not acceptable or seen as threatening in terms of the form of that leadership And then a lesser known fact here that I highlight here in terms of quotation from William C. Sullivan, the head of the FBI's Division 5, working, of course, under J. Edgar Hoover in the development of the counterintelligence program and all manner of scandalous and scurrilous behavior. Said immediately after Dr. King's what's supposed to be his more soft and acceptable "I Have a Dream" speech, already, as you see here, Sullivan has him being targeted and saying, "We must mark him now," quote, if that is, quote, "we must mark him now if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security." So already he's been targeted as a national security threat. Already Dr. King has been targeted by those at the highest levels of state and intelligence agency operation as someone who is a threat to national security and a threat to become to replace the vacated seat of by the martyred Malcolm X as the Black Messiah who would lead Black people in the United States towards Black nationalism and away from white liberal doctrines of nonviolence. Now, that doesn't mean that he was immediately seen or depicted or not maybe given a chance to walk away from that threatening position. Because as I'm just showing here, and we can sort of mark his descent, so to speak, in the eyes of the state, where not long after the assassination, a year after the assassination of Malcolm X in January of 1966, the Washington Post is noting that Dr. King is a, quote, most admired man. He's number 6 on the list of Man of the Year candidates. He's still seen as someone with great potential to sort of save the country from a Black revolution. Anyway, is sort of in the eyes of the state. And of course, by the way, we should understand that at least historically, if not so much today, the Washington Post has been not only one of the leading newspapers in the world, but primarily and specifically the mouthpiece of the state. That's where the political establishment most often would seek to plant its messaging. Traditionally, the New York Times was seen as the paper of record, the paper of the world, the maybe the most popular. The Wall Street Journal, specific to the economic elite, the financial elite. But the political elite, the mouthpiece primarily, particularly at this time, was the Washington Post. So this is when this is discussed in the Post, this it should be taken in that context and with that kind of weight. Similarly, in 1966, despite being considered the previous year, that is for 1965, a candidate for Man of the Year, a top candidate for Man of the Year, we already start to see that he's moving in a direction that will eventually put him in conflict with, again, that potential for him to escape his threatening label. Primarily because he goes to Chicago and starts to bring his efforts in the particularly the summers of 66 and 67 to Chicago, where he attempts to advance, quote unquote, the civil rights struggle. And he comes into conflict with the differences in between North and South. And that's where I think he was, becoming, and why I think he was becoming more clear and wanting to build with Malcolm X before he was assassinated, because there were important differences in the arrangements and relationships between Black and white communities, North and South. And as King thought he could bring some of those similar tactics in the South up North, thinking that he had survived Mississippi and Alabama, well, why not Chicago? Well, unfortunately, he was met with the reality that Chicago was Not much more different. And as Malcolm had pointed out, the real Mason-Dixon line is the Canadian border. If you're below that, you're in the South. So, but as you see here, he goes to Chicago and launches the most significant Northern freedom movement ever attempted by major civil rights groups, where he says our primary objective will be to bring about the unconditional surrender of forces dedicated to the creation and maintenance of slums, and to ultimately make slums a financial and moral liability upon the whole community. Now, imagine even in many of these so-called ghettos and projects and neighborhoods that exist still in northern cities to this day, the most prominent civil rights leader in the world leading not just sit-ins and protests and events, but collecting the rents of all the tenants that would instead go to landlords and keeping them to be used to improve the conditions of those housing units. Imagine the threat that would mean to the establishment, even as we think about just not down far from where I am now in Baltimore, and what we've learned over the years of Trump Jr.'s relationship to public housing throughout the country, but even just right down the street here in Baltimore. Imagine if Trump family's reaction if rents were not going to them and were being collected and redistributed in such a way that the horrible conditions people were forced to live in were being corrected. Similarly, the very next month, in February of '66, Dr. King meets Black Muslim leader for the first time. He sits down with Elijah Muhammad. Again, Elijah Muhammad also listed as a threat in the counterintelligence program documents. And we've already, as I briefly alluded to, where there was already an attempt to, in the press, to juxtapose King to Malcolm X, where Malcolm was meant to be seen as the threat and King meant to be seen as the acceptable option. And then here King is seen, at least in the mind's eye of the state, as moving closer towards that threat, while at the same time talking about what I just said a moment ago, collecting rents, and then saying that the rent presently being paid to the landlord would be paid to us, and then we will use the rent money to renovate the building. So he's in Chicago, he's meeting with Elijah Muhammad, he's talking about redistributing rents to take care of the conditions of the poor. He's not talking about event planning. He's not talking about simple sit-ins and symbolism. He's increasingly becoming, as we'll see, critical of legislation and its impact, and the electoral system and its impact, and capitalism on its own and its impact. And the response is predictable. Similarly, later that same year, March '66, Dr. King decides actually to ignore Vietnam in his talk while visiting Sweden. He was pressured from all sides to not internationalize the struggle for civil rights. This is very important because even to this day, as we see quote unquote movements rising that are popular online that are meant to replace these movements and are said to be even improvements specifically on the work of Dr. King, but who are also saying that Black Americans should isolate and make a singular isolated effort for redress. That we see here historically, that has been what has been encouraged by the state and by liberal forces and conservative forces to prevent radical and revolutionary change. It is seen that internationalizing civil rights or internationalizing the Black struggle is a threat. It's a threat to the state, who want to project that democracy and capitalism, as it's branded here in the United States, is a saving grace for everybody, meaning really U.S. Interests and capital and influence is seen as a net positive around the world. For bourgeois, conservative, reactionary, or plainly based liberal civil rights leaders who want to collect money from nonprofit and state-funded agencies and organizations. They don't want any internationalizing of those movements. Those looking to get funding and support from conservative religious outfits certainly don't want to internationalize those movements. So they put pressure on King, and at this moment, he acquiesced. But again, it's important to note, in comparison even to what's going on today, that the goal, the interests of those in power and those who stand in barrier against radical change don't want Black Americans to internationalize our struggle. Same thing here. April 1966, Dr. King warned to, quote, stick to his own knitting and to not talk about Vietnam and to not internationalize the civil rights struggle, which would, because if he talked about Vietnam, it would said that he would seriously, quote, seriously jeopardize new legislation meant to help Black people. So again, the argument, the just like we're told today, don't take certain political positions, even recently, don't, quote, hashtag force the vote for Medicare for all, because you're going to threaten the ability for AOC and the squad and Nancy Pelosi to have positions of strength in Congress and to stand against the more reactionary Republicans. Don't talk about don't talk about, quote unquote, defunding the police because you can't get Democratic politicians elected and you can't advance your own interests. The same thing was said here 50 years ago. Don't compare the Black struggle to Vietnam. Don't compare the Black struggle to other colonized struggles and anti-colonial movements in the world. Don't seek solidarity with Pan-African unity. Don't do that, because you jeopardize your own situation here. That's what the state is telling activists and movements then and now. So it is antithetical historically and today for people to make the argument that, quote unquote, Black America should, as it says here, stick to our own knitting and not make connections globally. Similarly, in May of 1966, we start to see already Dr. King's views, because he's even just raising these questions. His view in the mind's eye of those in power is starting to change. Dr. King is linked with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is seen as a youthful, more radical, militant wing of the civil rights struggle. Stokely Carmichael, et cetera, involved with that. And yet King is willing to work with them. And then here you have the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC, getting 100,000 plus signatures to have King brought up on charges because of his willingness and interest in raising internationally concerns of the Black struggle here, and his willingness to work with people to his left politically within the Black struggle here in the United States. So already you have people, so that it's, again, this idea that he is a hero and that he has always been welcomed and appreciated by this country and its political elite is again here shown to be patently false. Skipping ahead just a little bit, we know that in April of 1967, Dr. King gives his famous speech at Riverside Church, where he does come out publicly against the Vietnam War, and he does come out publicly saying things like bombs that are dropped overseas explode at home, because not only, well, in part because all of the resources used to kill Black and brown people overseas could be used and redistributed here to take care of so much of the inequality here. But instead, they would rather bomb Black and brown people for, quote unquote, wanting to become socialists or communists or wanting national sovereignty. And yet we're told here that there's no money or room for advance here. It sounds like, again, we hear the exact same thing today. We don't have money for healthcare. We can't afford healthcare. We can't afford a jobs program. We can't afford this. We can't afford that. But, oh, here's a hope in the CARES Act to make sure that the elite and hedge funds and major corporations can stay open and can have their stock value go up, and the 1% that own all that stock can keep themselves enriched, while many of the rest of us get furloughed, fired, lose businesses, jobs, et cetera, and certainly healthcare. But here in February of '68, King is explicitly making an appeal to the so-called Negro middle class, and he's challenging the class distinctions within Black America and the civil rights movement, explicitly saying that the so-called Black bourgeoisie is looking to take advantage of all of the gains of the civil rights movement. They're happily, moving into gentrifying neighborhoods and accepting positions at universities and political appointments here and there and wherever else. But meanwhile, the masses of Black people have their conditions worsening. Again, quickly fast forward to today, and almost everything, I shout out to Diedrich Muhammad initially, and then to the rest of the crew, as far as I was introduced to it, the United for a Fair Economy reports that have been coming out since 2004, which are the State of the Dream reports, which have been pointing out basically annually that since Dr. King's since 2004, at least annually since 2004, that since 1968 and Dr. King's assassination, the Black community has economically devolved in almost every major indicator of material conditions, largely because of the illusion of advance, because of the promotion of at least this is my interpretation of those reports, of the data of those reports, that largely or aided by the projection of a Black bourgeoisie, of a Black middle class, of a Black elite, of a Black political class, that has made advances. Well, here Dr. King is already saying, listen, the civil rights struggle was not meant for that. It was meant for the collective. And here we see that is already not the case. And then just sort of wrapping up this portion, not long, this is less than 90 days before he's assassinated, and I've always thought this is a very important headline. Not mentioned in this presentation. I mean, obviously he was demonized in the New York Times. He was demonized in Time and Newsweek. He was, going back even to certainly after his speech at Riverside Church, but even going back to previous statements where they were basically saying of him that he was, ruining his own, potential by leaning left. But here, and I've always, again, the headline is "Official Fears Grow" that that Carmichael will seize Dr. King's March of the Poor. Now, we have to remember that in the summer of 1968, Dr. King was planning. The plan was a March of the Poor that would lead to permanent encampments of thousands of people who would rotate in and out in front of the White House, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken. In other words, to not just march and go home, but to make a permanent display of the fact that, while the United States had no problem, again, going to war and transferring wealth ever upwards, the people on the bottom were suffering. And despite whatever gains were said to have come with civil rights legislation, Dr. King had become increasingly clear that, as he said himself, his dream had become a nightmare. He made allusions of the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights legislation as rushing a football to the 50-yard line and claiming a touchdown. In other words, he made reference to the fact that he said a newly integrated lunch counter in the South was now raising the price of a hamburger from 25 cents to $2 to economically segregate Black people out. In other words, the same kind of trickery we see still happening today, Dr. King was already starting to identify. And again, he was ever moving leftward radically. So the reason the officials were fearing that his March of the Poor would be taken over by Stokely Carmichael, again referenced in that 1966 COINTELPRO document as a potential threat, was because Dr. King was willing to work with Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and was increasingly, radicalizing his own analysis, as we can talk about in a little bit, to incorporate ideas of socialism, even communism. And as it says here, official fears are growing among top officials in the White House and Justice Department, that MLK's March of the Poor will be a stunning victory for Stokely Carmichael. They make reference to, King being captured by Lenin and Leninism and the Communist Party. And all of these, for anybody who studies political assassination, who studies the history of this country and the state, anybody who certainly read the incredible work on, for instance, Malcolm X's assassination by Zach Kondo, Conspiracies, where he really lays out the context for what happens when the State Department and the Justice Department and intelligence agencies who surveil you start to raise these concerns. And what they're ultimately talking, and what he and others have pointed to historically, is that what this is ultimately doing is setting the context and preparation for physical assassination. If not, at minimum, it's meant to marginalize. And as the counterintelligence papers also demonstrate, there were attempts to marginalize King, isolate him from the Black community, even to get him to commit suicide. But if you can start to isolate someone intellectually or in the mind's eye of even their own community as a threat. Daruba bin Wahad has said that one of the reasons the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army were not more successful was that many in the Black community had believed or succumbed to the propaganda presented about them by the state. So this is again part of that warning, or that threat being projected publicly, that concern being projected publicly by the state, where they're saying here again that the official fears are growing that if Dr. King, with all of his popularity, is succumbing to these more leftist and threatening politics and activists, there's going to be a real problem. And if we remember the even broader context of the United States being in the so-called Cold War, and engaging in Vietnam and engaging in Korea and engaging in the attempted invasions of Cuba and the overthrows in Iran and in Chile and in eventually in Panama and other parts of Central and South America, we have to, that all of this is happening, and the assassinations of Patrice Lumumba and Maurice Bishop and so many others is all happening in the context of trying to fight against the spread, or the specter, as Marx once said, of communism. And redistributionist politics. And it's just like it's happening now. And we mentioned yesterday in our great talk with Dr. Karanja about Assata Taught Me Beyond the Slogan, that part of the reason why Assata Shakur and Cuba are mentioned again as terrorist threats just the other day in the New York Times is because, I think at least, that as people are becoming again more attuned, obviously, to the horrific nature of our economic and social system and its impact on the majority of the people in this country and around the world, they want to raise questions about alternatives. And one way to make sure that they don't go too far with those alternatives, and as the counterintelligence program, as we started with, mentioned, you want to project the idea that, as was also pointed out in those papers, if Black youth want to become nationalists and revolutionaries, they need to learn that they'll become dead revolutionaries. Which, of course, unfortunately takes us here to April 4th, 1968, where Dr. King is assassinated. And on April this year, we'll come back to this in more detail, because don't have time this morning, but a full discussion, and with others more expert on this certainly than me, or than I, we should be involved in that conversation, and for a longer conversation. But it is important to note that Merrill McCullough, the first to Dr. King's body, was an undercover Memphis police agent who would eventually, as a result of his work here that day, evolve his career, so to speak, into the CIA. And he's also, as Dr. William Pepper and others have pointed out over the years, he's the first to point erroneously, to lead all of these folks pointing erroneously away from where the shot actually came from, and then starts to distort the entire context of King's assassination, who would have done it, how it would have been done, and why. But certainly his presence there suggests that it was far more than just the popular story of James Earl Ray. And in fact, even as the King Center in Memphis has a section noting there's a tremendous amount, some might even call it overwhelming amount of evidence to suggest the state was involved in King's assassination, as was the case with Malcolm X, as some have suggested with less evidence, unfortunately, but is likely the case with even Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture. But anyway, so I just wanted to show in this part of the presentation that this is in part one of the problems that we're struggling with, I think, in terms of many things, but in terms of how we understand Dr. King now, that we're often encouraged to see him as sort of an empty, politically empty, or certainly politically softened version of what he actually was and was becoming, and so that being too big to fail, so to speak, being too big to omit as a historical figure, he is just constantly rebranded and assaulted posthumously as he was physically dealt with in life. All right, so I want to let me stop that portion. I see some comments and chats that I haven't gotten to. I want to come back to them, but I want to show you one other piece. Just want to do one other piece of this very relatively quickly, and then I will try to come to some of the comments and chats and see if you know, because there's so much more obviously that we can get to. So I'm admittedly, and as we come back, you know, at 10 o'clock for the Hate Awards, we could talk about this in terms of I don't want to give too much away, but of some you know, pettiness. But I do acknowledge that my one and only quote unquote appearance on the historic and vaunted Democracy Now! Was sort of in the context of a disagreement over the way Dr. King is memorialized and commemorated. And I, at the time, just to set this up, in 2011 was working with Black Agenda Report and had done a commentary on the then newly established monument to Dr. King, not down the road far from me in Washington, D.C. And its corporate sponsorship, and why I think that that's, you know, then and now problematic. So I want to just bring up this clip of a visit to Democracy Now! in person of Jesse Jackson and the late great Dr. Vincent Harding, whose introduction to Dr. King's last full-length book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, which I often say, if someone says that they have not read that book, they should not ever be invited to talk about Dr. King anywhere. But in the forward to one of the newer editions, Dr. Harding had pointed out that Dr. King had maybe not gone far enough, or was too timid in his slow in his progression and his affinity for socialism and communist, or, you know, politics. Anyway, so Dr. Harding himself was aware of that, obviously being a speechwriter and close confidant of Dr. King. So anyway, Jesse Jackson and Harding are invited to Democracy Now! And sort of so was I, but so I want to just play this clip and then talk a little bit about it, and then I'll come to the comments and questions after that, and see if we can get to anything else here. All right, so make sure I'm sharing the audio. All right, so we'll just pick it up here, just play this for a few minutes.
Libya to Yemen to Syria to Libya, foreign policy is not very coherent.
I wanted to end with Vincent Harding. I'm looking at a piece by from the Black Agenda report by Jared Ball, who said, referring to corporate sponsors, of course, there are others like JP Morgan, Murdoch's DirecTV, Exxon, Target, Walmart, other bastions of workers' rights and liberty, all have come together to assure that King be forever separated from himself, from his anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-patient work for a genuine revolution. Can you comment on that, Vince Harding?
Oh, I would like to comment on it, my dear, especially to remind us that this country, this democracy that we're trying to create, was sponsored by slaveholders, slave owners, and slave traders. But that does not mean that that was the end of the story. As our great African-American teacher, who was one of our major Supreme Court justices, reminded us that though the country began in that way, we could go on to create something new. I'm not worried right now about who paid for the memorial. What I want to do and what I want to know is how the memorial and the spirit of King can be remade, can be taken over into our hands and carried on to the point where we can get past the concerns that King had for racism, for materialism, for militarism. Those were his three major concerns as his life ended. If we can take that on at this point in history, then whoever paid for the monument does not matter. We are the ones who will have to create the meaning of King for the future of this country.
We want to thank you both.
All right. So listen. I was never invited to actually come on and further discuss that. And rather than focus on where I might end up disagreeing with Dr. Harding, what I've always thought was interesting was the way, and maybe we'll talk about this another time, but there is sort of a background, I think at least, and I may be wrong on this too, but there is a background with me and Democracy Now!, with me and Amy Goodman, with me and some of the people associated with the production of that program. We were in a lot of the same spaces, particularly in that time in those same years. We had interacted a little bit here and there. You know, I'm certainly don't mean to suggest that I figured large in anybody's mind, but I was certainly not entirely unknown to Amy or anybody. And I just think it's interesting the way I was sort of set up there as a straw. Now, earlier in the conversation, another point was raised, or that similar point was raised with Jesse Jackson, and he's in his very skillful way sidestepped the point, saying he didn't really know who was involved, although that's highly unlikely. The idea that someone who's made most of the latter part of his career about bringing corporate, bringing Black civil rights struggle to corporate America would not be involved or aware of, at least as much as I was, of the corporate sponsorship of the monument is not likely. But he skillfully sidestepped the question. But more importantly, more importantly than the personal thing for me is that the strawing of that argument, not just me, the strawing of that argument leaves room and for a lot of the kind of confusion I think not only exists around obviously what Gramsci and others have talked about in terms of the politics of architecture, but the specific politics of this monument and monuments or statues or museums in this country. So I just want to make one more show you a little bit about, and I don't know if I put the link to that actual commentary in the YouTube here, but I'll put it later. And when I post this at imixwhatilike.org, where it actually already is, so it may already be linked, but I'll have to double check that. But one example, and this is just one article that I've found recently that makes the point, I think, well enough for today, of what I'm trying to get at here, or what I was trying to even get at in those commentaries, and that I think is importantly left out of so much of the discussion about Dr. King and his monument and others, etc. But just a couple of points here from this article from, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing her name, Louise Tythacott, Politics of Representation in Museums, for the Center of Museology at the University of Manchester, UK. She says here that her work here examines how these institutions have traditionally reflected the values of societal elites. And I can link to this article as well, which because I'm just going to go through some of these highlights very quickly and not do it justice. But she makes points here. While museums historically form part of systems of prestige, they continue to be associated with status and power today. And she talks about this not just in the United States, or not at all in the United States, but throughout other parts of the world. But I think it's perfectly relevant for here. And she says, for example, Tony Bennett argues that in the 19th century, museums became an important component of cultural governance, involved in processes of regulating the moral, mental, and behavioral characteristics of the population. That he notes spatial configuration of the 19th century museum, the balconies and courtyards and display cases arranged along evolutionary ideas of progress enabled them to function as a means for knowledge control and the observation and control of behavior. That museums are agents for establishing and policing norms of public conduct. By indoctrinating visitors with the current political ideology, going to a museum then, as now, is not merely a matter of looking and learning, it is also an exercise in civics. So again, if you think about, even if you haven't been, or if you just think about the National Mall in DC, where all of these, the Lincoln and the Roosevelt and the I can't even remember all of the, the memorials. I mean, it's this beautifully constructed, outdoor. I mean, it's this elaborate. So it fits well with what's being described here. The sort of ornate nature of it all. She goes on. Pierre Bourdieu too sees art, and Bourdieu has done some, by the way, some fascinating work on media and television too as well. But anyway, sees art museum as closely tied to power structures. Working in the 1960s, he conceptualized the art museum as exclusive domain of cultivated classes, arguing that it was only those equipped by education who have a mastery of the codes who are able to decipher the works on display. And again, if you know anything about DC, even historically, I mean, even the way it's laid out, this is, I think, an important point. In terms of an exclusive domain, even a relatively, not the biggest city in the world, it has a lot of pockets of exclusivity that most poor and Black residents of the city that still are able to survive and live there are never meant to see. The train doesn't run, first of all, it doesn't run all night and whatever, or late, very late, like in other parts of the world. It doesn't run to all parts of the city. If you want to get from northeast or southeast over to northwest, or certainly to pockets of northwest, like to the fancier Georgetown and other, you can't just take the train. You have to take buses or get some other sort of other transportation. In other words, it's not meant. So even going downtown, obviously, I remember teaching in Southwest DC at a public charter high school, and most of the students there had never, from DC, from northeast, mostly southeast DC, had never even been to Northwest. They had never even been to the monuments. They had never even been to these spaces. So they're not even, again, these are meant to be exclusive domains of the cultivated classes. So they're meant to convey a message to them. Culture, power, and class are related here, legitimating social differences and reproducing relations of power. As an important cultural site for the definition and distinction and taste, museums in this view become instruments of class hegemony. Carol Duncan also conceptualizes the art museum as a social, political, and ideological instrument. For her, like Bennett, they are performative environments. In particular, her writing focuses on their role as ceremonial sites that use display arrangements to promote national pride. The visitors to an art museum perform a ritual which constructs them as ideal bourgeois citizens. So again, you're meant to see Dr. King's memorial, even in the context of its arrangement there, as a matter of civic pride. Like Don King, another king. Only in America can you go from being enslaved to memorialized, while your people never change their condition or social relationship. I mean, it's to society, as it's amazing. The notion of museum as an organ of the state may be clearly manifested in national museums, like, again, the National Mall, but not particularly evident in small local sites and community-run or private museums. So it's particularly like the ones we're talking about here. Large civic or national museums have status conferring roles. They are expected to present authorized or established pictures of a nation's history and culture. And by the way, what is the established picture of King given at that memorial? If anyone goes, they notice there's only one quotation of his that is prominently displayed and etched in stone that comes from 1966 or beyond. In other words, from his most radical latter years, there is no reference at all, and no reference at all, period, to even the more radical statements he made prior to 66. So you're given a very manicured version of them. And never mind all the other controversy over the Chinese architecture and the way King looked even a little bit Asian-ish in the final construction. But anyway, the social power of museums derives from this belief that their views are sanctioned by the state. Again, obviously, a monument like that is sanctioned by the United States and is conferred in that context much more power. One of the most obvious ways in which the museums emanate power is through architecture and position. So again, think about the National Mall. Think about the prominent, the stance with King with his folded arms, looking, anyway. It's just a couple more here. More than any other, a national museum may be considered part of a state's political apparatus and representation. Benedict Anderson famously argued that the concept of nation is imagined because members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. The nation for him is created by people to serve specific purposes. It is abstract and anonymous and needs symbols as a way to manifest itself. Flags, coins, monuments, uniforms, and of course, museums give the idea of the nation a physical presence. Give the idea of the nation a physical presence. In this sense, national museums function to create bonds between individuals and the abstract political concept of the state. Exhibitions or representations within these buildings assume a particular social significance. Again, I couldn't agree more with this, and even think it could be reappropriated for Black nationalist radical purposes, but that's perhaps another conversation. But again, I think is so anyway, it wasn't simply that I'm saying, it's corporate sponsors. I'm saying that the reason there are corporate sponsors for this monument, the reason King is being projected now as someone they would accept, is because the real King is someone they don't want us to engage. They don't want certainly people younger today coming up to engage. They don't want, because again, internationalist, socialist, pan-African, radical nationalist, all of these politics to which King was moving toward, and with which he was beginning to work with increasing prevalence, are always discouraged. Now, I just want to say very quickly before then I'm going to get to some of these comments here, because I already saw that there are some very good ones, and exciting ones in particular that I'm going to in fact start with. That a shout out to my godfather, Mr. Tom Porter, who was the head of the King Center in Atlanta for a while, who knew the late Mrs. King, and many of the others associated with this conversation, as he has pointed out over the years. you have to not only read where do we go from here, chaos or community, but we have to read as he has given to me, which unfortunately because of a move and COVID and some other things, I can't get my hands on this moment. The speeches King gave to this SCLC leadership in the summers of 66 and 67, where you see him again saying, if it wasn't for this atheist thing, I think communism is a really good idea. Capitalism is a real problem. You know, the logic of this is to develop more Hitlers. I mean, these are the things he's saying, you know. So he's saying civil rights legislation is not enough, that it's symbolic, it's superficial, that we need to address the economic system. We need a guaranteed annual income, which some are raising again now. We need to redistribute the GDP, which some are arguing now. So I mean, this is, we need to link up with anti-colonial struggles in Latin America and the continent of Africa, which, you know, again, so this is what made King a threat. This is the version of King we're not meant to know. And I just want to try to bring some of my own work on this to the conversation on this platform, and to hear, you know, to get it, pun intended, in the mix. So, all right. So first of all, before I get any further, I saw some of you have already mentioned, and I appreciate you all for joining me and us this morning, but I saw some of you mention the late, great Steve Coakley in the chat. And I want to shout him out posthumously. A wild dude for sure. You know, difficult to keep up with physically or intellectually for sure. But I used to, for a time, in I can't even, I guess this would have been the early to mid 90s. I used to go to his lectures. It's now a Starbucks, but there used to be the Georgia Avenue Cafe near Howard University. I used to go to his lectures there every week for these marathon hours, Saturday mornings, I believe they were, where he would break down a lot of things, including what he believed was the Jesse Jackson involved assassination plot of Dr. King. And whatever, I know it sounds like when people were first confronted with that, when you lay out, starting with the context that I've briefly summarized here, and you start looking at some of the other evidence and some of the other, I mean, it raises a lot of questions for sure. And most importantly for me, and the way I would even approach this in my classes, and shout out to COM 300 and our conclusion today, a very appropriate conclusion to my time in the School of Journalism, and as I move happily over to African Diaspora Studies, African American African Diaspora Studies. Is very fitting that my last class there is COM 300, Communication in the African Diaspora, the Black Diaspora, that is. But as I often bring up in my classes, that what are raised by people like Coakley and others is, if not a concrete conclusion, evidence, more importantly, an introduction to what we don't know. We all have to at least acknowledge that there's so much that we do not know. And then having seen him, you know, I was on hand at the, and somewhere still have the video somewhere, when the late, great John Judge, shout out to him, and Cynthia McKinney had put on, when she was still in Congress, had used what year was this? Was this 2004? The Congressional Black Caucus weekend to have a huge, packed, not even standing room only, sitting room, squeeze in room only discussion of King's assassination, which included Judge Joe Brown, Dr. William Pepper, Steve Coakley showed up, John Judge, several others, experts on this issue. There are a lot of questions that still need to be addressed. And you cannot, I think, conclude concretely, for instance, that the state had nothing to do with his assassination. And you cannot conclude concretely that others weren't acting certainly suspicious within that whole arrangement as well. You know, so anyway, so big shout out to Steve Coakley. I brought him to Frostburg when I was an undergrad there, got to share, you know, extended car ride with him. I mean, you know, it's a very, you know, he was anyway, fascinating. Anyway, so let me see what else, if there's anything. Certainly, yeah. So this is, you're right. I saw the Steve. Yeah, I did see that documentary, and you see Reverend Kyles, make that statement, say, I moved out of the way so they could get a clean shot. I mean, it's remarkable. And yes, Vincent Harding was the author of the Time to Break the Silence speech. Again, it was in a year exactly later is when King is assassinated. Many have made the point that this was the turning point in terms of his relationship to the state. And as I was just trying to show in this presentation, it is again, even beginning before that, but certainly after that, King was demonized in the press, and many of the people who wept over the installation of his monument were not friendly with him towards the end of his life. They wanted to distance themselves from him because he was being seen as too radical and hurting their ability to get legislation passed and really to raise funds, etc. And of course, if anyone, you cannot understand Dr. King without reading this book. And really, if no one who has not read this book should talk publicly about Dr. King at all. It's just that is just the basic starting point. King's politics were so convoluted by revisionists that Obama was positioned as, and this is sort of the point that I've been making in some of my criticisms and arguments, when we put our book together, critiquing Manning Marables, when I wrote my essay critiquing Peniel Joseph. I mean, this is sort of the point that I'm getting at, that this is the scholarship. They represent the scholarship that gets translated into punditry and even activism that is meant to walk us away from the politics of a Dr. King and to make it seem like leadership of today is valid and legitimate. There could have been no Jesse, no Sharpton, no Obama, no Kamala. There's no Cory Booker. None of these folks could exist politically had Dr. King not been assassinated. It's really just that simple. And absolutely, and Messy Jesse, called him Messy Jesse all the time, and absolutely that he intentionally doused himself in King's blood so he could use that to position himself symbolically. And then he would talk about how the very next morning the New York Times already had the big story about how Jesse was the new leader. Cynthia and others had brought out the documents showing the CIA had wanted, there's a document that they brought out where the CIA had talked about wanting a, quote, clean Negro to replace Dr. King. And then, flash forward and you have people like Al Sharpton sitting on TV, literally actually saying that the civil rights struggle was conducted so that he could go to downtown cigar bars and fancy Manhattan, spaces and smoke cigars and fancy suits, where they were taping the particular interview I'm talking about. So whether we go as far as Coakley was going in reaching those conclusions, or whether we just do it a bit differently, it's pretty clear that there is no the space couldn't be occupied by the same politics or people. That is, you couldn't have Obama and Obama as he's currently constructed, and a King as he really was, in the same space. They were antithetical to one another. So anyway, listen, I appreciate you all joining me this morning. Honestly, I appreciate that you all would come through. I hope this has been of some assistance, and I do think it is a good way to start a commemoration of King on his birthday today, and what will be a weekend filled with misrepresentation of who he actually was, so that we cannot interpret how we are today. So I want to contribute to some way to again, as Tom Porter would say, negate the negation. of Dr. King. And so anyway, please come back in a little bit less than an hour, because at 10 o'clock, we're going to go from the love and a more serious discussion of the love of Dr. King and the love that he projected, to a far less serious comedic and satirical look at the hate that prevents advance and revolution and liberation in this world today. So please come on back. And again, thank you everybody for joining me here at I Mix What I Like Live. Please go to imixwhatilike.org and sign up there. Please click, share, subscribe here, click the join button and become a member of this channel. And there's so much more to come, including again at 10 o'clock, where we will get into the Hate Awards, the 8th annual 2020 Hubert Henry Harrison Hate Awards. You don't want to miss that. So come on back in a little bit less than an hour. And then until then, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. We'll catch you on the next edition of I Mix What I Like Live.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I